In today's lesson you're going to study the main battles of the Wars of the Roses. The war lasted for 30 years, and in it a series of vicious and extremely bloody battles led to the extermination of most of the barons, and the Crown of England changed hands 4 times. The first battle we will study is that of St Albans, fought on the 22nd of May 1455, which starts the wars off. Richard, Duke of York, launches his claim to the throne, and his main allies, who are the Nevilles, the Earls of Salisbury, and especially the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, with an army of 7,000 men, defeated a much smaller royal army of only 2,000 men, and in that battle the Duke of Somerset, who was Henry VI's chief advisor, was killed. The king himself was captured. Richard now becomes the Lord Protector in effective charge of the country. The diagram and map shows that the fighting took place actually in the middle of St Albans, down its main street, and the Duke of Somerset was actually captured and killed in a pub. After the Battle of St Albans, Richard of York had himself made heir to the throne, which put aside Henry VI's young son, 7 years old, Edward, Prince of Wales. Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou, and nobles loyal to her were not having that, so they raised an army and confronted Richard of York in the north, and Richard of York was defeated and killed near Wakefield in Yorkshire. This map shows the way in which the Duke of York was defeated. He controlled Sandal Castle, and you could see down in the plain below him what looked like a much smaller Lancastrian force, so he sent his army of about 9,000 men down the valley to attack it. Only most of the Lancastrian soldiers, they had an army of 18,000 men, had been hiding in the woods on either side, and as you can see they came out and attacked him, and the Duke of York found himself being assailed from 3 sides, and his forces were more or less exterminated, and he himself was killed. However, the death of the Duke of York had not brought an end to the Yorkist cause, because his 19-year-old son Edward was still alive, and Edward rallied his forces, and they met with the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, and certainly the bloodiest battle ever fought in England. 50,000 soldiers fought, and approximately between 25 and 30,000 of them were killed on that day. It fought in a snowstorm and with a very strong wind, and this strong wind favoured the Yorkists, who were able to fire their arrows at the Lancastrians, whose arrows in reply fell short of their targets because of the wind. During the fighting, the Lancastrian forces were driven into a river, which they actually became dammed with the number of dead bodies in it, and the water of it flowed red with the blood. There's a painting of the scene where the Yorkist archers are firing volleys of arrows at the Lancastrians with a strong wind behind them, and the Lancastrian archers in reply can't reach the Yorkists, so they're forced into a desperate charge and hand-to-hand fighting. It was the role of Warwick the Kingmaker, in putting Edward on the throne in the first place, had been a key role, but Warwick afterwards felt dissatisfied. He didn't think he'd been sufficiently rewarded. He wanted the king to marry his daughter, and instead Edward married this unknown widow, Elizabeth Woodville. So in 1470 Warwick rebelled against Edward, drove him out of the country, and recalled Henry VI to the throne. So Henry VI becomes the first English monarch to have 2 reigns, but it didn't last long. Edward was able to raise an army with which he invaded England, and on the 14th of April, in thick fog, his forces met Warwick's army, and in the fighting Warwick was killed. Here's an artist's impression of the death of Warwick in the battle. The battle itself was quite interesting, because the map maybe isn't very clear, but if you look at the left-hand side of the Red army, you see the forces led by Oxford, who attacked the left-hand side of Edward, the White Yorkist armies led by Hastings, and they drove them right back off the battlefield into the town of Barnet itself. But the problems came when Oxford's troops tried to return to their own army, when they came under attack from their own side, because remember, the people didn't wear uniforms, it was foggy, and in the confusion the Lancastrian forces were left vulnerable and exposed, and they were defeated, and Warwick was killed. 3 weeks later, the remnants of the Lancastrian forces were defeated at Tewkesbury near Gloucester, with all the leading Lancastrians being killed or executed in that battle, including Edward, Prince of Wales, Henry VI's 15-year-old son. And on his return to London, Edward IV had Henry VI, who was a prisoner in the Tower of London, murdered. So that left Edward securely on the throne until his death 12 years later. The last major battle of the Wars of the Roses was the Battle of Bosworth. Edward's early death at the age of only 40 led to a crisis. His boys were not grown up. Edward's 12-year-old son, also Edward, was now meant to be king as Edward V, but instead the throne was usurped, was taken over by their uncle, Edward IV's younger brother Richard of Gloucester, who became King Richard III, and Edward and his young brother, who's also another Richard, were put in the Tower of London and never seen again. They were the princes in the tower. However, many people in England did not accept the way Richard became king. They heard the rumours about the princes. Remember, no one knew for sure they were dead, but people knew they'd disappeared, and so some of Richard's supporters changed sides, and they actually went to France to offer the crown to the only real Lancastrian claimant left, who was Henry Tudor. But Henry Tudor had a very tenuous claim to the throne. He was descended from an illegitimate branch of Edward III. The Battle of Bosworth took place near Leicester on August the 22nd, 1485, and it resulted in the death of Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, when Richard launched a desperate attack to try to kill Henry in person, and instead it led to his own death, and of course a new dynasty comes to the throne. That was the end of the Plantagenets. There's only one Plantagenet left, and that was Edward IV's daughter Elizabeth of York, and she married Henry Tudor and bore him seven children, including 2 sons, Prince Arthur, who didn't live, and Henry VIII, who did, and he took the throne of England. So your task. What I want you to do is to choose one of those battles that I very briefly summarised. I want you to research in more detail, and I want you to think about why that battle is important. Start off with the, if you like, short-term consequences. That is, for instance, how many people died in the battle, did anyone important die, did the crown change hands as a result, and so on. Then also, did it have any long-term repercussions? Did it lead, for instance, to the war escalating or lasting longer? Did it put someone on the throne for longer than they would have been, or off the throne? Did it damage the Yorkist or Lancastrian cause? And finally, did it lead to a new dynasty?